In 1889, amidst the quiet plains of Illinois, a hidden story unfolded within a small, respected institution, a story that would haunt the town for generations. For decades, the dark truths remained buried beneath bureaucracy, silence, and forgotten records, escaping even the cold eye of science. This investigation reveals the haunting realities behind the sealed doors of the Whitmore Brothers Institution in rural Illinois. Long praised for its progressive treatments and humanitarian care, the institution concealed secrets far darker than anyone dared to imagine. In the winter of 1889, nestled in the isolated fields of Macon County, Illinois, stood the Whitmore Brothers Institution. A sprawling brick complex with pristine grounds and neatly trimmed hedges, it appeared as a beacon of progressive mental health treatment. Founded by brothers Jeremiah and Theodore Whitmore in 1875, the institution promised an enlightened approach to caring for individuals deemed mentally ill or socially problematic. Jeremiah, the elder brother, was a respected physician educated at Johns Hopkins, known for his gentle demeanor and rigorous adherence to scientific method. Theodore, a charismatic entrepreneur, was admired for his financial acumen and persuasive charm, qualities that allowed him to secure ample funding from wealthy benefactors across the country. The Whitmore Institution quickly built a sterling reputation, particularly among the affluent of Chicago and St. Louis. Families sent their troubled relatives here not merely because it was convenient, but because it was considered elite, humane, and progressive. The brothers had secured endorsements from notable medical professionals and academics, praising their innovative treatments and enlightened view toward mental health, contrasting starkly with the punitive asylums of the era. At a time when institutions regularly subjected patients to horrific conditions, overcrowded cells, forced labor, and inhumane experimentation, the Whitmore brothers pledged a therapeutic alternative. Well-lit dormitories, expansive gardens for exercise and contemplation, and cutting-edge scientific research aimed at curing mental ailments. Publications across the Midwest extolled the institution's humane policies and scientific advancements. Jeremiah's papers on treating melancholia and hysteria using non-invasive methods were featured prominently in prestigious journals. Theodore's ability to attract donations and legislative support led to the opening of several additional wings, creating a sprawling campus that accommodated hundreds of residents by 1889. Local newspapers frequently ran laudatory pieces highlighting patient recoveries. One particularly famous article from the Decatur Weekly Chronicle, dated March 14, 1888, profiled a young woman named Mary Ellen Hodges, previously considered incurably insane due to fits of hysteria and mania. After 3 months under Jeremiah's care, Mary Ellen reportedly returned home healthy and stable, proof of the institution's miracle workings. Such stories circulated widely, fueling the institution's impeccable reputation and drawing more patients, many from prestigious families, into its halls. Yet despite the glowing reviews and positive accounts, whispers persisted among residents of nearby towns, especially in the taverns and back streets of Decatur. Although public praise was loud and frequent, private concerns were subtly voiced among skeptical locals who worked as cooks, cleaners, or gardeners within the institution. Rumors drifted through the foggy air of evenings, alleging strange noises echoing from beneath certain wings, secretive midnight activities, and odd comings and goings. But the institution's respected status was impenetrable, and such murmurs never gained serious traction. Outwardly, Jeremiah and Theodore presented themselves as models of morality. Regular attendees at church, active community participants, and generous benefactors to local charities, they were the epitome of upstanding citizens. Jeremiah, particularly, was beloved in Decatur, frequently visiting local schools and hosting educational seminars to teach about mental health, reducing fear and stigma around mental illness. Theodore was equally admired, often seen mingling at social galas, charming local politicians and securing influential allies who ensured the institution's favorable status in state inspections. The brothers' impeccable image shielded them from serious scrutiny. Regular inspections required by Illinois law always passed without issue. Inspectors consistently praised the institution's orderliness, clean accommodations, and the progressive treatment methods documented by Jeremiah. Visitors and philanthropists were often given curated tours showcasing the impressive facilities, immaculate gardens, and satisfied patients engaged in arts, music, or peaceful rest. The Whitmore Institution became a model for the humane treatment movement nationwide. Yet behind these carefully orchestrated presentations lay peculiarities. Former employees, dismissed abruptly or without clear explanation, spoke cautiously in private gatherings about questionable practices. An attendant named Thomas Green, who left employment under mysterious circumstances, confided quietly in an 1888 letter that he had seen rooms beneath the north wing, places not marked on official blueprints. Green's account described heavy iron doors and reinforced windows, a stark contrast to the sunny open spaces described publicly. These whispers, however, rarely went beyond idle gossip, dismissed as bitterness from disgruntled employees. Still, curiosity persisted, albeit softly, among the residents of Macon County. Several villagers claimed to witness late-night wagon movements entering and exiting the institution through rarely used gates at the back of the property. One local farmer, Benjamin Watts, living adjacent to the property, mentioned strange silhouettes visible in upper-story windows late at night, figures pacing restlessly, illuminated briefly by lantern light, sometimes crying out. However, Watts and others who voiced such observations were generally dismissed or silenced by the institution's reputation and influence. This curious balance between admiration and suspicion allowed the institution to thrive. By 1889, its growing campus stretched impressively over 100 acres, housing approximately 350 residents. Wealthy families from across the Midwest entrusted their loved ones to the Whitmore brothers' expertise. Even distant newspapers such as the Chicago Tribune and St. Louis Globe-Democrat lauded the brothers for their pioneering efforts to humanize the treatment of mental illness. But the institution's perfect facade began showing cracks, quietly at first, imperceptible to those far removed. Jeremiah, though brilliant, grew increasingly withdrawn and nervous. Staff noted his irritability and the intensification of peculiar rituals. Unusual nighttime experiments he justified as necessary research, yet which no one was allowed to witness closely. Theodore meanwhile grew more involved in politics, lobbying state officials, and aggressively seeking to protect the institution's interests, even as internal management suffered. Employees felt his previously genial demeanor giving way to stern warnings about confidentiality and secrecy. By autumn 1889, subtle warnings emerged. A young nurse named Abigail Carter, newly hired, was struck by the strict division between daytime and nighttime staff duties. During daylight hours, patients were treated gently, and nurses administered medication under meticulous supervision. Yet at night, different staff appeared, faces Abigail rarely saw during daylight, people whose tasks were ambiguous but whose demeanor she found unsettlingly secretive. Abigail's innocent questions were met with polite dismissal from senior staff, who advised her that curiosity was not welcome in the Whitmore Institution. Adding to the strange atmosphere, a notable event occurred in November 1889. A respected visiting physician from Chicago, Dr. Ernest Langley, toured the facility intending to document progressive treatments for his research. However, after his brief visit, Dr. Langley abruptly cancelled future engagements, refusing further communication or comment about his time at Whitmore. His silence puzzled colleagues who knew him to be forthcoming, but no investigation followed. The doctor's withdrawal simply filed away among unimportant anomalies. Despite these peculiarities, Jeremiah and Theodore skillfully managed the institution's image. Donations continued flowing, and legislators reinforced their support, unaware or unconcerned with quiet, localized doubts. Throughout December 1889, holiday celebrations at Whitmore Institution continued with cheerful reports reaching the newspapers about festive banquets, patient art exhibitions, and musical recitals. But underneath the surface celebrations, a shadowy reality lingered. waiting quietly for someone willing to delve deeper. No inspector, journalist, or politician dared or cared enough to probe beyond the visible excellence. The whispers, faint and ignored, continued to drift unnoticed through winter air, but by then it was too late for many whose voices would soon be permanently silenced. As the year drew to a close, the Whitmore Brothers Institution remained a shining star in Illinois' landscape, its reputation untouched by scandal or suspicion. But buried deep beneath its manicured lawns, pristine corridors and smiling facades, a horrifying truth awaited discovery, one so disturbing and inexplicable that not even science, the very cornerstone of the Whitmore legacy, could offer an adequate explanation. Throughout the early months of 1890, the Whitmore Brothers Institution appeared to flourish. Newspaper reports continued to portray Jeremiah and Theodore Whitmore as visionaries in the field of mental health. Articles celebrated the brothers' work as a beacon of humane treatment, a model that institutions nationwide ought to follow. The public face remained flawless, its reputation impeccable. Yet beneath the polished exterior, cracks widened, hidden in plain sight, waiting patiently for someone to acknowledge them. Abigail Carter, the young nurse who had joined the institution in autumn of the previous year, found herself increasingly disturbed by what she saw around her. Initially attracted by the institution's progressive image, Abigail quickly noticed discrepancies between public portrayals and internal realities. Small subtle inconsistencies first aroused suspicion: mismatched patient counts on the nightly roster, odd disappearances of residents whom senior staff casually dismissed as transferred to other institutions, and restricted access to certain wings and basement levels marked staff only. Abigail began quietly documenting these discrepancies, uncertain yet driven by her growing sense of unease. She noticed that certain patients, often young men from affluent families, were frequently isolated, rarely permitted contact with other residents or even staff nurses. Senior attendants, men with cold expressions and terse manners, handled these patients exclusively. Abigail observed them only briefly, glimpsed behind closed doors or in hurried movements down forbidden hallways. These patients seemed lost in a perpetual state of anxiety, sedated and quiet, eyes vacant or wary, as if continuously awaiting punishment. Her attempts to seek clarification were met with subtle but firm warnings. One night, she approached Martha Ellsworth, an elderly nurse who had worked at Whitmore Institution since its opening. Abigail's question about the patient's strange treatment brought a shadow across Martha's normally cheerful face. Lowering her voice cautiously, Martha whispered a short, stern warning: "Don't ask about things you're not supposed to see." After that, Martha avoided Abigail's gaze entirely, isolating her from other nurses who sensed Abigail was becoming overly inquisitive. Nonetheless, Abigail continued her quiet investigations. She learned from scattered conversations with other staff that Dr. Jeremiah Whitmore was frequently absent during daylight hours, spending most of his time locked away in the North Wing laboratory, accessible only to him and select senior attendants. Theodore Whitmore, meanwhile, intensified his interactions with powerful state officials, regularly hosting private meetings within the institution's lavishly furnished administrative building. Abigail wasn't the only one who noted oddities. Thomas Fletcher, a local blacksmith whose property bordered the north side of the institution grounds, had long observed unsettling nighttime activities. Often working late into the evening, Thomas frequently witnessed wagons pulled by black horses slipping quietly into the rear gate of the institution, transporting large crates and barrels whose contents remained hidden. Initially dismissive, Fletcher grew increasingly concerned when he once observed attendants hastily carrying a limp, motionless figure wrapped in canvas into the basement of the North Wing. Despite reporting this to Decatur authorities, his concerns were summarily dismissed as misunderstandings, further silenced by Theodore's influential connections. While Thomas Fletcher's claims were publicly disregarded, the number of such observations steadily increased. Local residents whispered about strange lights visible through small basement windows late at night, accompanied occasionally by muffled cries, quickly silenced. Benjamin Watts, the farmer whose land bordered the east side of the institution, recounted seeing men burying heavy sacks in the ground behind the gardens, always under the cover of darkness. However, Watts feared the Whitmores' influence enough to remain silent publicly, sharing his concerns only among neighbors, spreading unease quietly through local communities. Amid these scattered reports, an even more unsettling mystery surfaced. In February 1890, a 20-year-old patient named Frederick Cole vanished from the institution, despite official records showing he had been discharged home to St. Louis. Abigail Carter, who had briefly interacted with Frederick before his disappearance, found the institution's official explanation dubious. Frederick had been profoundly troubled but gentle, often pleading quietly with Abigail about his fears of a special treatment that patients whispered about when attendants weren't nearby. He'd described seeing others taken away late at night and returning changed, blank-eyed, subdued, as if stripped of their very selves. Alarmed, Abigail discreetly wrote to Frederick's family in St. Louis. Weeks passed without a response, but eventually Frederick's mother, a woman of some influence named Margaret Cole, arrived unannounced, demanding answers about her son's whereabouts. Theodore Whitmore, confronted directly, offered a carefully rehearsed explanation. Frederick had suffered a relapse shortly after leaving the institution and was subsequently admitted to a private hospital near Chicago, one which he politely declined to name. Theodore assured Mrs. Cole of her son's safety, convincingly enough to calm her fears, at least temporarily. Yet Abigail remained unconvinced. Carefully she gathered evidence, secretly compiling patient logs and copies of altered records, hiding them beneath floorboards in her small quarters. She uncovered other vanished residents, each explained away by similar vague stories about transfers to unnamed facilities. Despite the growing danger of her inquiries, Abigail's determination remained firm, driven by a sense of moral obligation she could not easily ignore. Her suspicions reached a tipping point in March 1890, following an incident involving Jeremiah Whitmore himself. One evening, Abigail, scheduled for night rounds in the eastern dormitory, found herself mistakenly entering a restricted hallway leading toward the north wing. From behind a partially open laboratory door, she glimpsed Dr. Whitmore engaged in something she would never forget. He stood hunched over a patient strapped to an operating table, surrounded by unfamiliar attendants. Instruments glistened ominously beneath harsh gaslight. Jeremiah, usually composed and gentle, appeared tense, almost manic, as he directed procedures Abigail couldn't clearly discern. The patient, though heavily sedated, moaned faintly in discomfort, muffled by some restraint or apparatus obscuring his face. Terrified, Abigail retreated silently, heart pounding. The next day, she carefully questioned Jeremiah's primary assistant, John Crandall, about the incident, feigning innocent curiosity. Crandall responded icily, warning Abigail explicitly against venturing into restricted areas again, subtly implying severe consequences for those who defied institutional rules. Abigail understood the gravity of her situation. The institution's formidable reputation protected it from scrutiny. Official investigations were non-existent, dismissed out of hand by officials firmly in Theodore's influence. But Abigail refused to let fear silence her completely. Instead, she decided to reach out anonymously to a journalist at the Decatur Weekly Chronicle named Walter Pierce, known for his investigative work uncovering institutional corruption. In early April, Abigail sent Walter a cryptic message describing hidden practices at Whitmore Institution, advising him to investigate the secret basement beneath the north wing. Intrigued, Walter began quietly probing around town. He discovered former employees like Thomas Green, who were now willing to speak privately about witnessing strange activities, including locked subterranean rooms where unidentified patients were isolated for unknown purposes. Slowly, Pierce accumulated evidence indicating something deeply sinister occurring beneath the institution's polished surface. Yet even Pierce hesitated to confront the Whitmore institution openly, knowing full well its formidable political and social influence. His inquiries remained cautious, conducted discreetly at night, interviewing witnesses in secretive locations, collecting fragments of evidence while fearing retribution. Gradually, though, Pierce's quiet investigations gained momentum. He identified multiple former patients whose family members insisted their loved ones had never returned home, despite institution records claiming otherwise. As Abigail awaited Pierce's next move, the Whitmore institution itself intensified its security. Theodore ordered stricter measures, isolating problematic staff, restricting employee movements, and doubling down on secrecy protocols. Unbeknownst to Abigail, her covert investigations had been noticed. Senior attendants monitored her closely, noting her every interaction and restricting her access to patients. The atmosphere became oppressive, heavy with suspicion and fear. By late spring of 1890, Abigail realized the severity of the danger she faced. Her communications with Pierce slowed, hampered by increased scrutiny from senior staff. Meanwhile, whispers among employees suggested she was not the first to raise suspicions, and those who had previously done so had been swiftly removed or silenced. Abigail recognized she had little time remaining. Either she must expose the institution fully, or she risked becoming another forgotten name on the growing list of vanished witnesses. In this tension-filled atmosphere, the subtle whispers became increasingly urgent. The community of Macon County felt the looming unease, yet continued to turn away, shielded by disbelief, fear, or outright complicity. The sinister reality beneath the Whitmore brothers' facade now stood on the brink of exposure, its darkest truths waiting only for a final, desperate act of courage to bring them fully into the unforgiving light. In the early summer of 1890, the weight of secrecy within the Whitmore brothers' institution became unsustainable. Walter Pierce, the investigative journalist from the Decatur Weekly Chronicle, continued quietly gathering evidence, now aided secretly by Abigail Carter, whose courage grew even as the dangers mounted. Their collaboration, though perilous, began to reveal undeniable truths, dark secrets deeply embedded in the foundations of an institution long revered. Walter knew caution was imperative. If the Whitmore brothers suspected anything, they would easily leverage their connections to suppress him permanently. He meticulously documented everything: discrepancies in patient records, testimonies from former employees, and accounts from nearby residents who had long been silenced or ignored. Piece by piece, the facade crumbled, revealing a monstrous reality behind the institution's glowing reputation. On June 15, 1890, Abigail Carter found a note hidden beneath the door of her quarters. It was short, urgent, and anonymous. "They know. You must leave tonight." The handwriting was unfamiliar, the tone chillingly certain. Abigail, deeply frightened but determined to survive, quickly gathered her concealed records and notes, bundling them beneath layers of clothing. She realized she had no choice. Her life now depended entirely on escaping unseen. That same evening, under cover of darkness, Abigail quietly exited her room. The halls were eerily quiet, the air thick with oppressive silence. She moved quickly, guided only by instinct and fear. As she reached the northern gate, she heard footsteps behind her, a soft but persistent sound, deliberately paced to match hers. Panic rose, nearly overwhelming her, but she maintained control, slipping through a narrow side gate rarely used, shielded by heavy foliage. She managed to reach Decatur, breathless and desperate, arriving at Walter Pierce's modest home in the early hours. Her sudden appearance startled Walter, who immediately recognized the urgency. Without wasting time, Abigail laid out everything: the notes, logs, patient records, and eyewitness accounts she'd meticulously gathered. Her revelations were devastatingly detailed, painting a horrific picture that even Walter found difficult to process fully. Together, they decided that an immediate, direct investigation was necessary. With Abigail now safely hidden in a small cottage at the edge of town, Walter mobilized a small, trusted group of local citizens: Benjamin Watts, Thomas Fletcher, and former attendant Thomas Green, who was eager to expose the atrocities he had witnessed. Armed with lanterns and rudimentary tools, they planned a secret midnight entry into the Whitmore Institution's basement, aiming to uncover physical proof of the crimes Abigail had described. On the night of June 17th, Walter and his small group approached cautiously. The institution lay in darkness, its formidable structure shadowed ominously beneath a moonless sky. Thomas Green guided them toward a hidden entrance at the rear of the north wing, concealed beneath dense shrubs and an aging wooden hatch. Carefully removing the covering, they descended into a damp, narrow passageway, the air pungent with mildew and something else, a deeper, unsettling scent that made them pause nervously. Lanterns held aloft. Their dim lights revealed narrow corridors lined with heavy iron doors, many secured with formidable locks. Thomas Green whispered shakily, recalling his earlier experiences as they moved deeper into the underground complex. His voice trembled with memories he'd long tried to bury, experiences he now willingly shared with the group. "They keep them here," Green whispered, "the ones they experiment on. Jeremiah's research. It isn't about healing. Here it's something darker, control obedience, reshaping the mind." Walter urged caution as they continued. Soon they reached a large door, partially ajar, which opened into a horrifying room. Shackles hung from stone walls, filthy cots lined the sides, and medical instruments, rusted and cruelly shaped, lay scattered across stained tables. Pierce, trembling, examined journals hastily abandoned by Jeremiah Whitmore, each filled with chillingly detailed records of experimental procedures, attempts to cure patients by removing portions of their brains, forced chemical injections, and techniques designed explicitly for psychological manipulation. The details became unbearably clear. Jeremiah Whitmore's celebrated scientific breakthroughs were built on grotesque human experiments. Pages upon pages documented patients' agonized reactions, the torturous methods employed, and callous notations describing how some patients failed and were subsequently discarded, their fates obscured by falsified records indicating transfers to non-existent institutions. Benjamin Watts, moving through another corridor, suddenly called urgently for the group. Joining him quickly, Walter and Thomas Fletcher found Benjamin staring into another, even darker chamber. Stacked neatly against walls were wooden crates previously seen transported by late-night wagons. Opening one, Thomas recoiled in shock. It contained human remains carefully preserved in chemicals, each labeled meticulously as subjects of Jeremiah's gruesome research. Among them, Walter recognized the name Frederick Cole, the young man whose mother had come desperately searching just months before. Pierce, now visibly shaken, documented everything swiftly. But as they turned to exit, footsteps echoed from above, the unmistakable sound of many men approaching. Panicked whispers filled the dark passageway as they realized their discovery had been noticed. Walter swiftly extinguished their lanterns, signaling the others to remain silent. Moments later, a door above swung open violently. Theodore Whitmore's authoritative voice echoed through the stone hallways, accompanied by the stern commands of his senior attendants. The intruders pressed tightly into dark corners, hearts racing, as Theodore and his men searched aggressively, lanterns casting eerie, shifting shadows. After what seemed an eternity, the voices faded, moving to search elsewhere, giving Walter and his group a slim window to escape. Carefully retracing their path, they hurried out into the night, taking with them undeniable evidence of institutional atrocities. They reached Decatur safely before dawn, exhausted but resolute. Within days, Walter Pierce's shocking exposé appeared on the front page of the Decatur Weekly Chronicle, shaking the state of Illinois. His detailed report, complete with testimony and irrefutable physical evidence, sent shockwaves throughout the region, prompting immediate demands for an official investigation. Yet, even faced with overwhelming evidence, the institution fought aggressively to maintain its carefully constructed image. Theodore Whitmore utilized every political and social connection at his disposal, vehemently denying the accusations, portraying them as malicious fabrications by disgruntled former employees. Jeremiah, however, quietly disappeared, his whereabouts unknown even to his brother, leaving behind unanswered questions and incriminating evidence that could not easily be dismissed. In July 1890, Under intense public pressure, authorities finally intervened. State investigators descended upon the institution, uncovering even greater horrors beneath the surface. More hidden chambers were discovered, additional victims' remains unearthed, and survivors, patients profoundly traumatized, rescued. Each revelation confirmed the depravity hidden behind decades of public acclaim. Abigail Carter bravely stepped forward during the formal inquiry, testifying in detail despite threats against her life. Her testimony proved crucial, describing first-hand observations, conversations, and conditions within the institution, painting an undeniable portrait of systemic abuse and sadistic experimentation. Ultimately, the Whitmore Institution was officially closed in September 1890. Theodore Whitmore, despite attempts to shield himself behind powerful allies, was arrested and later sentenced to life imprisonment, convicted not only of complicity in his brother's crimes, but also for orchestrating cover-ups and manipulating public trust. Jeremiah Whitmore, though relentlessly pursued, vanished without trace, a mystery haunting investigators and townspeople alike for generations afterward. The revelations rocked Macon County to its core, forever shattering the institution's carefully crafted facade of humanitarian progress. Yet, despite official condemnation and closure, the community struggled to reconcile the horrors exposed. Many preferred silence, quietly burying the Whitmore brothers' grim legacy beneath layers of collective denial. But the memory refused to die entirely. Stories lingered, whispered warnings passed quietly from generation to generation. Abigail Carter's bravery and Walter Pierce's dedication ensured the truth would never fully fade, an enduring reminder of humanity's capacity for both monstrous cruelty and courageous integrity. In the aftermath of the Whitmore Brothers Institution's closure, Macon County faced an agonizing period of reckoning. The institution's shocking crimes shattered public trust and left the community deeply wounded, grappling to make sense of the unimaginable horrors that had occurred within their midst. Yet despite public outrage and official investigations, the deeper questions, how such atrocities were allowed to persist undetected for so long, remained largely unanswered, fading quietly into an uncomfortable silence. The immediate response was swift, but ultimately superficial. Local authorities moved quickly to raze the worst-affected buildings, particularly the infamous North Wing, removing tangible reminders of the horrors committed there. By the winter of 1890, all that remained were foundations hidden beneath layers of earth, slowly reclaimed by weeds and grass. For many in Macon County, this physical erasure symbolized an urgent need to bury their memories alongside the institution's ruins. Theodore Whitmore languished in prison, defiantly silent to the end, his once charismatic personality deteriorating rapidly behind prison walls. Despite numerous appeals and interrogations, he refused to provide further insight into the nature or purpose of Jeremiah's experiments. His silence denied the families of victims any chance for deeper understanding or closure, compounding their grief and anger. In 1895, after 5 years in prison, Theodore succumbed to tuberculosis, taking with him critical knowledge of the institution's darkest secrets. The disappearance of Jeremiah Whitmore, however, remained the most troubling mystery. Despite extensive searches and nationwide alerts, Jeremiah vanished without a trace, his fate never definitively confirmed. Rumors persisted. Some believed he fled overseas, others whispered of suicide, while a few quietly speculated he remained hidden nearby, watching silently from afar. Jeremiah's unresolved fate perpetuated an eerie sense of unfinished business, ensuring the shadow cast by the Whitmore brothers would linger for generations. Abigail Carter, the young nurse whose courageous revelations exposed the institution's atrocities, found her own life irrevocably changed. Initially praised as a heroine, Abigail quickly discovered the personal costs of speaking truth to power. Ostracized by former colleagues and shunned by segments of the community uncomfortable confronting their complicity or silence, Abigail relocated to Chicago, seeking anonymity and distance from the pain she'd helped uncover. Yet even in her new life, Abigail remained haunted, plagued by nightmares and a lasting distrust of authority. She rarely spoke publicly about the Whitmore institution again, retreating into solitude and obscurity. Walter Pierce, the journalist whose reporting had brought the institution's horrors to public attention, continued his career passionately advocating for reform in mental health care and institutional accountability. However, the revelations had taken their toll. Increasingly frustrated by public apathy and official resistance to systemic change, Walter grew disillusioned over time. In 1903, he published a comprehensive memoir detailing his investigation into Whitmore, hoping to spark renewed discussion. But the book, despite initial interest, soon faded into obscurity, its chilling accounts quietly ignored or dismissed by readers unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths. Walter Pierce retired shortly thereafter, deeply disappointed but resigned to society's reluctance to face its darkest realities. In Decatur and the surrounding communities, the response was complex and multifaceted. Many chose active denial, dismissing the Whitmore scandal as an isolated aberration, a grotesque anomaly that bore no reflection on their values or community. Public discourse soon shifted, focusing on brighter narratives of growth, prosperity, and progress, relegating the institution's victims to the shadows. Others acknowledged the tragedy privately, quietly teaching their children cautionary tales of hidden dangers beneath respectable facades. Yet publicly, few dared openly discuss or reflect deeply on the implications of the scandal. Over subsequent decades, the institution's horrific legacy slipped quietly into local folklore. By the 1930s, few direct memories remained. Details blurred into exaggerated myths and ghost stories whispered among teenagers, daring each other to explore the ruins at night. Each new generation grew further removed, increasingly skeptical of older, chilling stories their elders preferred to forget. Yet beneath this skepticism lay an uneasy recognition that some part of the town's history remained unresolved, a dark chapter whose true lessons remained unlearned, quietly suppressed beneath layers of community silence. This silence, pervasive and deliberate, had profound consequences. Although superficial reforms were introduced in state oversight and mental health treatment, broader systemic change proved elusive. Public institutions remained vulnerable to similar abuses, shielded by bureaucracy, political influence, and collective unwillingness to acknowledge institutional failure. The Whitmore institution, horrifying though its revelations were, served as a stark reminder of society's powerful instinct to bury uncomfortable truths rather than confront them fully. In the mid-20th century, occasional efforts arose to revisit the Whitmore case academically or journalistically, driven by renewed national focus on institutional abuses. In 1962, historian Rebecca Carter, a descendant of Abigail Carter, attempted to publish a comprehensive study of the scandal. Yet Rebecca's work met surprising resistance from both publishers and local officials, who claimed reopening old wounds would serve no constructive purpose. Frustrated, Rebecca privately published a limited run of her study, but its impact remained minimal, overshadowed by more immediate societal concerns. In the late 1980s, however, interest resurfaced when construction crews accidentally uncovered hidden basement foundations on the former Whitmore site during road expansion. Local newspapers briefly reported the discovery, reigniting speculation and discussion. Older residents, uncomfortable recalling the horrors once so thoroughly suppressed, downplayed or dismissed the findings, swiftly reburying evidence beneath layers of concrete and asphalt. Once again, silence prevailed, and the community returned to uneasy normalcy. Yet not everyone embraced silence. A small group of local historians, activists, and descendants of survivors insisted on preserving memory as a moral duty. Through oral histories, quiet commemorations, and persistent advocacy, they challenged the prevailing narrative of silence. In 1990, marking the centennial anniversary of the Whitmore Institution's closure, this group organized a quiet memorial service attended by fewer than 24 people, an event receiving scant media attention. Nevertheless, their dedication ensured the institution's victims were not entirely forgotten, their suffering acknowledged privately, even as broader society continued turning away. Today, the Whitmore Brothers institution remains largely unknown beyond scattered historical records, vague references in local folklore, and the quietly passed down stories whispered in Macon County homes. There are no official memorials, no public acknowledgements of institutional complicity or widespread social responsibility. Instead, the institution's legacy is silence, an enduring, uneasy quietness that lingers stubbornly beneath the community's surface, a reminder of humanity's capacity to overlook or deliberately forget its darkest truths. Ultimately, the Whitmore institution's true horror was not merely the atrocities committed within its walls, but the profound willingness of society to ignore clear signs, to bury uncomfortable realities beneath layers of denial, and to perpetuate silence rather than confront complicity. The legacy of the Whitmore brothers is not simply one of shocking cruelty, but also one of collective moral failure, a failure that, if unaddressed, ensures similar tragedies will inevitably occur again. As each generation moves further from the horrors of 1889, the story risks fading entirely into oblivion, reduced to a footnote or a forgotten warning. Yet beneath the quiet plains of Illinois, the ruins of the Whitmore Institution remain buried, a silent testament to the darkness humanity is capable of concealing when it chooses ignorance over courage, silence over truth. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way, we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.